Hello and welcome to US Lacrosse's webinar on head protection in women's lacrosse. I'm Ann Kidd-Carpenetti, the Managing Director for Game Administration, and I'm also a women's game official and a former player.
I'm Melissa Coyne. I'm the Women's Game Director for US Lacrosse, and I am also a former player.
We appreciate you making the time today to join us in this webinar. It's important to bring up that we are going to be doing a 20-minute presentation for you today, after which we'll open up the phone lines or the lines on the computer for questions. You will be muted throughout the presentation, so hopefully you'll be able to hear us okay. And we do plan on recording the entire presentation, including your questions, so that we'll be able to disseminate that to the lacrosse public afterward. So we're going to jump right into the webinar today, talking to you about the purpose of our webinar, which is primarily to bring you up to speed on the injury priorities in women's lacrosse, with a focus on head injuries. We want to inform you of what we've done so far, and specifically in the last few years, to address the number of head injuries we're seeing, and also hear from you about any concerns or questions you may have about our efforts. We want to give you a little bit of a background on the types of research and education that we've done to inform the public about the problem that we see and what we've used to inform our decision making so far. We also want to take some time today to specifically talk to you about our efforts to establish a women's lacrosse specific headgear standard, what the process is, what we've done so far, and what is coming down the road, or what we expect to come down the road.
Why are we concerned about head injuries in women's lacrosse? First and foremost, the landscape of the game is changing. We have many more players playing, and what that means is, yes, there are more people playing, but there are more people getting hurt. It's become more of a media focus, as it is in every sport. Concussions are a focus of every sport at every level, and we are no stranger to that. Players are getting stronger and faster, and there are more of them, obviously, again, to be injured. They're doing a better job, athletes telling their trainers when they're hurt. Trainers are reporting this kind of stuff. It's just an uptick in the observation of head injuries. Our current data has shown pretty minimal decline in head injuries over the last few years. So it's certainly something we have to address because we haven't seen any great decline. And lastly, we are facing scrutiny, really, from state associations, from media, from school administrators, parents, asking us to consider adding additional protection for women's lacrosse. The next slide is the most common injuries in women's lacrosse. Having said all that about head injuries, lower extremity injuries are still the #1 injury in our sport, whether it's ACL or ankle. That still is #1. In terms of head injuries, which don't always result in concussion, the mechanism that is most frequent in our sport is stick-to-head contact, and it happens more frequently in games than in practice. When we're talking about concussions, this is a growing issue for both the men's and the women's games and across all sports, as I've mentioned. This is a significant organizational focus for us. We've invested a ton of money and time on research and really getting to the crux of the problem, what's happening. Our Sports Science and Safety Committee has weighed in and will continue to weigh in on this issue. And then there's a list here, which I know most of you know, about the different interventions that we have pursued with regard to changes in rules, better rule enforcement, better education of our coaches and officials. All of these things will continue parallel to us pursuing a track to provide additional equipment protection.
So I want to give you a little bit of a background in terms of what we've been doing with respect to research and education to better understand injuries in women's lacrosse, specifically head injuries. You'll see on this list a completed list of research projects and current and ongoing research projects. They primarily focus on trying to better understand the incidence of head injuries, the mechanism of head injuries, and also the impact of other interventions and rule changes that we've made over the last few years to try to address injuries that we're seeing in the sport. You can find all of this information on the US Lacrosse website under our Sports Science and Safety section. There are 3 particular research pages that I want to walk you through that are very important, that help set the stage for our focus on identifying an appropriate intervention to address stick-to-head contacts in the women's game. The first bit of research comes from an 11-year study led by members of our Sports Science and Safety Committee and other esteemed members of the sports medicine community. A key finding in that research was that, we have a problem with concussion. The incidence rate is up there amongst the top 3 of all women's sports that have been studied. And the other key finding is that, as we mentioned earlier, that women are getting concussed and getting injured above the shoulder. And the primary mechanism for women is stick to head. What we know also is comparison to boys lacrosse, which we don't often do, of course, but it is a helmeted sport, a helmeted version of a different sport, but the concussions are not coming from stick to head. The concussions in men's lacrosse are coming from body to body. They are not seeing concussions from stick to head contact. The other important finding in our research was looking prospectively at our eyewear intervention. In 2004, US Lacrosse and the NCAA required protective eyewear to be worn at all levels. At the time, we didn't have a huge issue with orbital eye injuries, but they were an injury that were serious enough that if we could provide an intervention to eliminate or see a significant decrease in that injury, we were interested in pursuing that. And some years later, it did appear to do what we intended it to do. It virtually eliminated all orbital eye injuries in women's lacrosse. And so we believe that that's an important bit of research to demonstrate that interventions through equipment can in fact work. And the last bit of research that's worth noting is relevant, again, to the question of an appropriate headgear standard for women's lacrosse, and why we're looking at headgear as opposed to traditional helmets. Helmets in football, in men's lacrosse, and in ice hockey were developed not to prevent concussions. They were never designed to do that. They were designed to prevent against catastrophic head injuries and skull fractures, and they do a superb job of doing that. But they do not do a great job of preventing concussion. One thing that's worth noting is in women's lacrosse, there's been a study that spans about 30 years. We have never had any catastrophic head injuries in women's lacrosse, thank goodness. And so therefore, it didn't make a whole lot of sense for us to immediately apply a standard that was developed for an injury that we don't see for sports that we are not. And that is one reason why we are not pursuing a helmet for women's lacrosse, and why we believe a unique standard is the right way to go.
So what does this all mean? Women's lacrosse has a unique need for protection based on our mechanism of injury. We will continue, USL, and I know the women's game will continue to take a lead on the different ways that we're using intervention, whether it's an equipment intervention or if it's just to continue to enforce the rules, educate coaches and officials, and all the things that we're already doing. We'll continue to do them. Sorry. The next slide is related to equipment standards for headgear. What is the need in the game for them? Right now, protective equipment that's being worn has no standard or testing data to support whether it has any qualitative value to it at all. And that's a concern for us. It's dangerous and it's irresponsible. And it's certainly something that we need to address. Without a standard, for the Rules Committee to be making decisions about what's legal for play or not legal for play is arbitrary. And we certainly don't want to appear to be arbitrary about those things. And I think a standard has to be in place to ensure that we have consistency and quality of protection.
One point to add to that is without a standard, officials also have a tough time determining on the field, is this legal today? Can this team play? And so providing more guidance to our officials and to our administrators and coaches is something we really need to address right now. This next slide, again, this is one of the things that is really important for us. The pressure that we are getting, whether coaches are getting it from their administrators or parents are getting it from, from doctors or whatever the case may be. We want, as USL, to continue to have control over any interventions that are made in our game. And the more that we are at the forefront of this kind of research and dedication to this issue, the more we're going to continue to be in control of those decisions. So we can't simply turn our heads and say we don't want to see head protection in our game, because somebody else will make those decisions for us, and we don't want to see that happen. So one way that we've again approached this whole development of an appropriate standard is we've really taken a look at what is out there and figured out and tried to say, you know, is that appropriate? Can we apply that? Again, this is just a slide to reiterate what we already talked about, which is that the NOXI helmet for men's lacrosse is designed for a unique set of rules, unique set of equipment, unique culture, and unique set of injuries and mechanism of injury. And so designed for a collision sport, which you all know women's lacrosse is not, based on a football helmet standard and testing, and obviously women's lacrosse couldn't be any more different than football, and was designed to prevent against injuries that we're not seeing in women's lacrosse. The next few slides are things that I know you are all extremely well versed in as leaders of the organization, the sport, but it has been an incredibly important point to make to folks who are not familiar with women's lacrosse, that don't understand the difference between men and women's lacrosse. It has been our focus in terms of educating manufacturers and educating administrators that it's the contact that's different, and therefore it is the equipment that should be different. It is the injuries that we're seeing that are different, and it is the rules that we're seeing that are different. And therefore, you know, we don't think an ice hockey helmet is appropriate. We don't think a football helmet is appropriate. But we are not 100% sure what exactly the force of impact of the stick hitting a head that we're trying to mitigate. Could it be something like a bicycle helmet? It could be. Could it be something like a rugby helmet? It could be. Well, all we know is that the helmet that we see in football and men's lacrosse and ice hockey was designed to prevent against an injury that we have not seen in women's lacrosse. So therefore, we think that another solution is something we ought to pursue.
We put this slide in here sort of as a joke. It's something that we saw when we went to another meeting, but I think it can be somewhat humorous in this setting. In terms of what a headgear standard would look like on our end, that really is going to be dependent on what the research shows us in terms of what could be effective against stick-to-head contact. So this is a joke. I'm partial to Darth Vader, but you know, this is just to make it a little bit lighthearted. We don't know. We really don't know at this point what it'll look like. We're at the very beginning stages of that.
Well, there was a picture of someone with a spear on their head, actually, yep. The alien, I think. That's probably a good one. So we're coming to a close in our presentation, going to bring you up to speed in terms of what we have done with respect to pursuing standard in women's lacrosse for headgear. Back in 2010, after getting advice and consult with our women's game leadership and our sports science and safety, we pursued NOXI, which is the National Operating Committee on standards for athletic equipment. They are the organization that has established the football and men's lacrosse helmet standard, and asked them to help us develop a unique headgear standard for women's lacrosse. You know, we've shown you some of the research that's been done to make our case that a unique standard is needed, but there's a lot more research that needs to be done. And NOXI recognized that, and ultimately earlier this year they determined that they didn't have enough information to make a recommendation on a unique standard. However, they did agree to fund some research to help us better understand how much of an impact force is created when a stick hits a head form. One of our esteemed members of our Sports Science and Safety Committee, Dr. Trey Crisco, is leading that research, and we're hopeful that in the fall of this year we'll have the results of that research. And while we received that decision from NOXI in January, and we're waiting on the research, we do have an issue that we're dealing with now. You've seen some pictures of players out there wearing all kinds of headgear. We want to be able to provide our community with a standard that is appropriate, so we decided to also pursue another route, which was another standard body called ASTM. ASTM probably sounds familiar to some of you because it is the standard writing body that established the standard for women's lacrosse eyewear back in 2004. They are more of a consensus-driven organization. Anyone can be a part of the organization. We asked them to establish earlier this year a headgear task force for women's lacrosse that would help to bring experts from the manufacturing world together with sports science and safety experts, with women's game leaders, to have a dialogue about what an appropriate standard might look like for women's lacrosse. And they agreed to establish that, and we actually are planning to attend and present at that meeting next week in Phoenix, and many members of our US Lacrosse board and leadership and sports medicine community will be in attendance there to make sure an informed dialogue takes place. One thing that's important to note, it is an important meeting, it's an important milestone in our efforts, but we don't expect a standard to be developed at that meeting. There is going to be a timeline that I'm going to talk to you about as we close the presentation that we think this whole process could follow. But it is important to note that we're planning on recording this presentation for the benefit of those attending the ASTM meeting who are not lacrosse people, and there will be non-lacrosse people attending this meeting.
If you look at this next slide, which is different ways of hopefully being able to prevent some of the concussive activity that's happening in our game, we're asking if this is possible. This is the question. This is the million-dollar question we want to ask. Is anything that we are doing here, whether it's through the list of enforcing rules or coaching or officiating or an equipment intervention, will any of this prevent concussion in our game? The answer is really no. You can't prevent every concussion, but are there other steps that we can take to help mitigate some of these concussions happening? And that's really our question that we want to answer.
And the concussions, I would say the real focus point for us is the stick-to-head impacts.
Right.
The ground ball collisions that occur, you know, really there appears to be nothing that can prevent that. Even the ball to head, it's not as pressing a concern to us as the stick-to-head contacts. And so while there was the million-dollar question is, can concussion be prevented? In homage to Dick Clark, the $25,000 question is, once a standard is developed for women's lacrosse headgear, will it be mandated? So I want to try to bring you up to speed on what we think will be the process for the development of the standard and what could be in the future, because we don't actually have it all planned out, meaning we don't have an agenda to put X in the rules and have it mean Y. We're going to go through the process, which includes evaluating our research ongoing, funding research as needed. We're going to continue to work on pursuing an appropriate standard. We're going to continue to work on making sure our rules are doing what we intend them to do. We're going to continue educating our coaches to teach the rules in the spirit they were intended to be taught. We're going to continue to educate our officials and train them to consistently enforce the rules. That's all going to go on, but we do want to have a standard in place, an appropriate standard that we can start to consider. And we're hoping that that'll happen within the next year. Following up from this ASTM meeting, there will be a working group that'll continue to needle and work on the language around an appropriate standard. We'll be studying the research that comes out of Dr. Crisco's efforts this summer. And after that, we have to look to our manufacturers to say, okay, we like this standard. Would you be willing to develop some models, and can we test them? We have to work with manufacturers, because if there's a standard we like and we come to the table and we say, go ahead and develop something, but we'll never put it in, we'll never allow it, that no one's going to design anything. We're not going to guarantee a mandate. We're not even going to guarantee that we'll be able to support the standards that's established. In my mind, I think Melissa agrees, there's a spectrum of options we have. We're fully behind the development of a standard that's appropriate for our game. We can support it, we can reject it. We can allow it, we can recommend it. We can endorse it, and yes, we can mandate it. And I think to take any of those options off the table, or to tell any of you that those options are not viable, would not be fair. I think that we just have to be open, and hopefully we can gain your support that we are trying to take the right and responsible path to providing additional protection to those players who want it.
The very last slide here is just the references for the different studies that we used. So if you're looking at this presentation and you wanted to know where any of the data came from, there is a reference page here for you. And just finally, I just want to thank everybody who's participating, the women's game leadership, you know, for your participation, your effort, your leadership. All these things are going to continue to be very important as we go down this road. And I know it's a crazy time of the day to do this, but we appreciate you coming.
And we appreciate your participation in this next part of the webinar. Thanks, Melissa. So we're going to close right on the 20-minute mark, actually I think a little bit early, and want to encourage those of you who have questions to send them in if you haven't done so already. And just to make sure you know that we're not going to hear you, but we're going to get your questions. We're going to do our best to answer them. And then, again, we're going to record this, and it's going to be made available to the public, and it will be sent directly to those folks attending the Headgear Task Force meeting at ASTM within probably 24 hours or so. And then, again, any questions that you have that may be more technical or research-oriented in nature, we're happy to send them on to members of our Sports Science and Safety Committee after the webinar, and they'll get back to you. All right, so Liz, do you have any questions for us?
Okay, it's not showing me who the question's coming from, but I can read it anyway. From Danny Caro, the head coach at Quinnipiac University, asking us to speak about face masks and whether US Lacrosse will allow them and or create a standard for them. I think that's a good question. I don't think we have the answer to that. Again, that's going to really be tied up in how the standard is written. Right now we have protective eyewear that has all but eliminated orbital fractures for us. There have been some concerns this year that have come up about jaw injuries or other things, and there certainly is a contingent that believes that something that comes a little bit lower would be better. But at this point, again, we would need to see that research. We'd need to see all of that before we would make a decision on that. We would prefer, obviously, not to go the face mask route, but we don't know what they'll come up with.
And I guess this is an area where I've been a little bit more pointed with some folks that we're concerned about the injuries occurring from sticks hitting the head. There are injuries that occur to the nose and to the jaw and to the face, but the research that we have seen, primarily through the National Federation of High Schools work through the Rio study, these are not major injuries that are occurring, and they're also not a cause of concussive injuries or serious head injuries. So we're primarily focused on addressing those types of injuries. You know, and I agree with Melissa. There are those folks who just want to, you know, go the next step. But we are focused on trying to mitigate those types of injuries caused from sticks hitting a head. And so at the time, we're not pursuing a standard for a face mask. We're not asking that manufacturers create a design that integrates the face mask. What we're asking is that they integrate the protective eyewear that is currently required.
The next question comes from Paul in Maryland. While stick to head is critical, what issues are involved regarding the ball? This is actually a really serious point of concern for both the men's and women's game. The NCAA, the NFHS, they've all brought this up. There are some pretty, there's high concern about the performance qualities of a lacrosse ball, and that some meet a standard and then some are manufactured and don't quite meet that standard. The consistency of the ball can change based on temperature. The density is changing. We've seen in the men's game situations where a ball is slipped through a face mask. This is a big concern, and certainly on the women's side, anything that affects the consistency of the ball, it might make it harder, is not a good thing for our game. So it's certainly something we're looking into this year.
Melissa has left the conference.
Right now there is a standard. NOCSE has a ball standard, but we can't guarantee that all lacrosse balls are being manufactured to that standard.
So we're working with NOCSE right now. We're working with the National Federation. We want to, the first thing to do is to get everyone to follow the standard, and then figure out how does an official know that the ball meets that standard. So it would probably have to be stamped all with the same standard logo. Perhaps NOCSE is what we're all thinking of.
Right.
And that we can expect that something like that would be introduced into the rules, or it's actually already in the rules, but we need to get the manufacturers on board with that.
And NOCSE is very serious about this. They're going to do some of their own studies about it, and it may happen that there are some changes to the way the ball is designed or how it's manufactured. So stay tuned with that one. That's definitely a big topic for us this year.
Good question.
Next question is from Jen Eames. She's our women's game chair. A lot of the research presented is on concussions, which helmet and headgear has never been shown to prevent. Is there a particular injury, laceration, contusion, etc., that will tell AFTM we want prevented by this standard? This presentation seems to imply concussions.
Well, I think I think we're talking about concussions and head injuries that are caused by stick-to-head contact. I think the interesting thing that we've seen from our research, again, not to bring up men's lacrosse, but in men's lacrosse, guys are not checking each other in the head intentionally, but guys do get hit in the head, and they are wearing protection that appears to have some benefit in terms of preventing concussions from checks to their head. So it's likely that there's something out there that can be worn that can mitigate the impact of a stick hitting a head and could potentially eliminate or really cut down on the number of concussions that are caused by stick to head. I don't think we're coming to ASTM and saying we're looking to eliminate all concussions and all head injuries through the development of an intervention, because as Melissa said, and I said, we can't do that through any means. So I think if we're really focused on the stick to head, because it does appear that there are products out there that can address that. I don't think we need all that protection, because remember, the helmet was designed to prevent against a catastrophic head injury. A stick hitting a head is not a catastrophic head injury. It doesn't create that. It doesn't create a skull fracture. So I think we need to dig into really understanding what that impact force is, and say that it's, not all concussions are equal. There's gender factors in concussions, and there are head injuries that are not concussions. I think the soft headgear allowance, it was never designed to prevent any type of serious head injury. That's in our rule book. It was designed to address lacerations, bruises, and I think it probably does a fine job of that. We're not asking for a better headgear to address lacerations. What we're asking for is a headgear that players who want to use can have access to it, and it actually will have demonstrative value in terms of providing protection from those type of hits.
Right.
That's exactly what we're looking for.
There's a spectrum of injury that occurs from a stick to head contact, and is there a standard that can be developed that can address that spectrum? That's really what we're looking for. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Next question. This is from Tricia Dean. She is the chair of our youth subcommittee. There are manufacturers out there promoting soft headgear for girls lacrosse, and in their advertising they're saying this product is approved by USL for use in games. Do we have any manufacturers' products that are specifically approved by USL for use in the girls' game? With the absence of a standard, I thought USL does not approve any specific equipment. I can speak to this because I've been sort of dealing with this directly. This is sort of the conundrum we've gotten ourselves into. We have an allowance in our rules, and the rules are written by USL on the high school and on the youth level. So when a manufacturer contacts us and says, we have a piece of protective equipment, tell us whether it meets our rules. The moment we say yes, there is that, it can be implied that it's approved by USL because we are the rule-writing body. We have been very clear with manufacturers that we do not endorse or support these products. We don't know their value or if they have any protective value. That what we're simply saying is that according to our rules, it is legal for play. That's not to say that manufacturers won't use our words and twist them the way they want. They've always done that, and they will continue to do it. But that is really the position that we're taking. We are not endorsing these products. We are simply telling you whether they're legal for play, which makes it all that more important that we get a standard so that we don't have to make these decisions, and the manufacturers have a standard to design to, and really we can take the USL approved out of it.
And until we get that standard, we've discussed a variety of ways to help the consumer better understand what they can use. There are products that we've looked at that we say, well, that's hard. There's hard protruding edges on that. They may say it's got some soft parts, but it's got some hard parts too. When you look into our rules, the reason why certain things are allowed and certain things aren't are because it can't hurt anybody else. It has to be soft if you want to wear it on the field, and it can't hurt anybody else. So we're looking at products, and some things we say, no, that doesn't meet, that's not allowed within our rules. Some things we look at and we say, yeah, that fits in our rules, and we give them very specific language in terms of what they can and can't say. But the consumers and officials, again, would probably benefit from some clearer guidelines on what is permissible and what is not, in a similar way that we've done with sticks and eyewear. But again, the implication would be that that there is a standard and we are supportive of it. So we're really working to try, not to fast track this process, but to make sure that we can provide information to consumers about what it all means and what they can expect to see on the field.
Next question is from Laura McNally. ASTM has a standard for the goggles. Who has checked that standard? Do the newer models without the lower bar raise concern for cheek and facial injuries? A coach asked about face mask, and does the current smaller eyewear? I think I understand what you're asking. The ASTM standard for goggles has been reviewed. It's updated, I think, on a biannual basis. But you'll notice where it says F803, it'll have a dash next to it. The newest one says 11. It's reviewed by ASTM, but it hasn't been reviewed, I would say, by our
Rules Subcommittee or by our Sports Science and Safety Committee in some time.
And we do have concern about some of the newer designs that lacks more the lower protection it had before. Now remember, these goggles were designed to mitigate orbital fracture. It didn't include
from a ball
hitting the face. Yeah. It did not include nose or jaw
or temporal area.
Temporal area, any of that. So the testing that's done is specifically ball to front of face mask. So anything that's designed only has to meet that standard. Again, that is something that we are concerned about and that I'm sure will come up in this discussion at ASTM.
I would say as a whole, it's a great question. Laura, by the way, is a member of our Sports Science and Safety Committee. She's out of Massachusetts. I think, you know, we need to look at all standards that we're responsible for, not just protective equipment. We also establish the standards for sticks, and there are a lot of factors that play into ensuring that there's a safe environment on the field. Eyewear is something we absolutely need to review. And again, we want to provide manufacturers the opportunity to innovate and create products that players like to wear that look good. But at the end of the day, if what we're trying to address is additional protection, especially, you know, there's a lot of talk about this area of the head, a very vulnerable area, it may be worth reviewing the eyewear at the same time as we're pursuing a standard for headgear to see if there's something we can do to make the protection as good as it can be.
This question doesn't have a name, but it is, what is the timeline for getting studies completed and making a recommendation on headgear? Months, years? There are a lot of moving parts in that conversation. Dr. Crisco is conducting his research. In the meantime, we're going to speak to ASTM about coming up with their standard. There's a period of time for writing that standard. There's a period of time for manufacturing that standard, then testing it, and then doing research on top of that. So if you're looking for the long-run answer of what's going to happen with headgear in the women's game, it is on a year's basis. This is not going to happen in 3 months or 6 months. There will be progress made, but in terms of getting all those things completed, this is a year's timeline as opposed to shorter term. And quite frankly, we want to make sure that we are being as thorough as possible. So if it takes us, though we have a vested interest in seeing this happen sooner than later in terms of protecting the players, we want to make sure we do it the right way. So if that takes us longer, then it takes us longer. Next question. What is a realistic expectation for US Lacrosse coming out of the ASTM meeting?
What we're hoping for is, I think at the base level is that there's a really open and informed dialogue. Through this webinar that we're providing in advance of the meeting, we're hoping we'll be able to get to this meeting and not have to go through the basic differences. This is men's lacrosse, this is women's lacrosse. We'll be able to sit down with manufacturers, people who are biomechanical engineers, to really understand injury mechanisms and have drafted and developed standards for other sports, and have a real discussion about what we're looking for, both in terms of protection, what is reasonable for us to expect. I mean, if we came to the ASTM meeting and said we want to eliminate all concussions, it's likely manufacturers and bioengineers would say, you know, that's not possible. Your expectations are up here. So managing our expectations, and we're hope that we'll be able to tell them what we're looking for in terms of a design. The design is the last thing that happens in this process, but we do want to talk to them. We're not looking for a Darth Vader helmet. I mean, we're not looking for something to look like even a men's lacrosse helmet. And this is an important opportunity for us to share what we think an appropriate piece of equipment might look like, might feel like, and I don't think we really had that opportunity to talk directly with manufacturers about that yet. So that's what we're looking to have occur. And then hopefully after that discussion, that we have an influential role in determining who's going to follow up and form a group that will actually sit down and start to draft a standard.
The next question again comes from Jen Eames. I'm going to paraphrase this just a little bit. Jen is asking about the different rule changes that we made this year in the women's game, which are significant, both checks through the steer, the on-field 2-minute penalty for yellow cards. There's change in the definition of dangerous checks, all those things that we've done that could very well affect the injury statistics for this year. What does that do to this discussion about headgear? That is, to me, that's very important to me. I think that the changes that we've made this year in the game need to be given some very serious consideration. If we get data back that suggests that we've now, because of these rule interventions, cut 25% of our injuries down. That could very and should play into our discussion about what type of headgear, maybe not what type of headgear is needed, but maybe the need down the road to mandate. If we continue to see drops in the amount of injuries that are happening in the game, specifically stick-to-head injuries, then it seems logical that we wouldn't have to mandate a piece of protective equipment, but we can make it available for someone who wants it or maybe had injuries in the past. So I think that's very important.
And so, and as well, our efforts to certify coaches and train officials all across the country as we continue to put more resources into that and gain more support behind state associations and local groups. We believe that a trained coach and a trained official contributes to a safer environment for players. And as we see that increase, and we hope that all of you who are both leaders in the game at the national level in your communities are encouraging that, because we do believe through effective rule implementation, training of officials and coaches, and appropriate equipment interventions, we can, and others who are experts in the field of injury prevention, specifically concussion, also agree with us that can sometimes do a better job of decreasing injuries than just alone an equipment intervention. It's not a silver bullet.
That was the last question.
All right. Wow. This has been great. If any of you have any other questions after the webinar, again, please feel free to contact Melissa or I, and we'll do our best to get back to you as soon as possible. We thank you again for your participation today and your great questions, and most importantly, your support overall for US Lacrosse and the work that we do. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.